Pregnant black woman assaulted by cop. But cameras captured everything. Under a sky turning gold with evening light, Layla Bennett walked steadily down the cracked sidewalk, one hand cradling her swollen belly, the other gripping the brown paper bag that held a small box of lemon bars and a thermos of homemade soup. It was her husband's favorite, something she'd spent all afternoon preparing in their modest apartment on the south side of Chicago. She wore a long cardigan, soft with age, and comfortable shoes that barely softened the ache in her feet. At 7.5 months pregnant, every step was calculated, careful, but her smile stayed. Jamal had been working late at the counseling center all week, helping a new wave of returning veterans, some barely out of their teens, most carrying ghosts behind their eyes. Tonight, Layla wanted to surprise him, give him a moment of peace, a moment of something warm. Her pace slowed as she neared the corner of 83rd and Ellis, where the sidewalk narrowed near an old vacant lot fenced with rusted wire. That's when she heard the voice. Harsh, sharp, unmistakable. You, what are you doing here? She turned and saw him. Officer Madsen, a large, square-jawed man with pale eyes and a hand already hovering near his holster. She blinked, confused. I'm just walking home, she said quietly, clutching the bag tighter. Madsen didn't back off. You look like you're loitering. Got that slow, sketchy walk. People who loiter tend to be up to no good. His voice wasn't loud, but it had that edge. The kind that said he didn't expect an answer. Layla's hand moved to her belly instinctively, as if shielding it. I'm just going to see my husband, she offered gently. I live right up the block. Madsen narrowed his eyes. You getting smart with me? I asked you a question. Her throat tightened. I answered it. Please. I just want to get home. A group of teenagers across the street slowed their walk. One of them lifted his phone, began filming. Madsen took a step closer. Now you're resisting. That's obstruction. He raised his voice. Stop moving. She froze, heart pounding, the baby's foot twitching inside her like it could sense something was wrong. I'm pregnant, she said. I'm not resisting anything. I am scared. Don't make this worse. Madsen's lips curled into a sneer. Then maybe you shouldn't have been out here looking suspicious. The next moment happened too fast for thought. He shoved her shoulder hard. Her body jerked, stumbled. The bag fell. Soup spilled onto the sidewalk. Layla caught herself with one arm, but barely managed to stay upright. Another shout came from the crowd. She's pregnant, man. Chill out. But Madsen didn't stop. He stepped forward and, with a short, brutal motion, lifted his boot and kicked her straight in the stomach. A collective gasp rose around them. Someone screamed. A woman sobbed. Layla fell back hard, hitting the concrete with a sickening thud, her hands scrambling to protect her belly, her voice caught somewhere between pain and disbelief. Madsen looked down at her, indifferent. Should have complied, he muttered, then turned and walked away like she was nothing. Just another shadow on the pavement. The video caught it all. No music, no shaky footage, just raw horror under a setting sun. The cries, the chaos, the silence that followed as Layla lay still, clutching her middle. Her breath shallow, her eyes wide. She didn't even cry. She just looked up at the sky like she couldn't believe this was how it ended. But it didn't end, because someone called 911, and the ambulance arrived fast. Paramedics rushed. Sirens wailed. A young EMT whispered softly to her the whole ride, squeezing her hand, trying to keep her awake. Her name is Layla Bennett, he repeated to dispatch. She's pregnant, possibly 8 months. Abdominal trauma. We need OB on standby. Jamal was wiping down counters at the vet center when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something in his gut told him to pick up. Is this Jamal Bennett? Yes. Your wife's been assaulted. She's en route to South Shore Medical. Meet us there. That's all he needed. His mind shut off. His body just moved. Coat, keys, door, running. He didn't stop to ask how. He didn't even ask who. Not until he burst through the ER entrance, heart hammering, sweat chilling on his skin. Where's my wife? Layla Bennett. They sent him up. Room 403. His feet barely touched the ground. When he reached the door and saw her lying there, everything slowed. Her face was pale, bruised, lip split, but her chest rose and fell barely. Machines beeped in quiet rhythm. Tubes. Monitors. Blood pressure. The doctor spoke fast. There's trauma. We're monitoring for abruption. Her stress level's high. She may have lost some blood flow. We're watching closely. Jamal nodded, but he barely heard. His eyes were locked on the dark blotch forming on her belly, just beneath the thin hospital gown. The baby. Please. He whispered it like a prayer, over and over. Please. Don't take them both. Behind him, nurses moved quietly. Lights dimmed. Layla stirred, eyes fluttering. Jamal rushed forward, took her hand. I'm here. I'm right here. She blinked once. Jamal. Her voice was thin, broken. He kissed her fingers. Don't talk. Just breathe. We're going to be okay. You're strong. You're always strong. She shook her head slowly. Her eyes filled. You saw the video. He nodded. Yes. Then you know. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Her voice cracked. He just kicked me. I know. I saw. He pressed his forehead to hers. You didn't do anything wrong. And we're going to make sure the world knows that too. That night, Jamal didn't sleep. He sat by her side, watching her chest rise and fall, whispering soft words to the child inside her. He didn't cry. Not yet. Because he knew what came next. The world wasn't going to fix this for them. So he would have to fight. For her. For their baby. For justice. Not later. Now. The morning light filtered through the hospital window as Jamal sat in silence, hands clasped together, elbows on his knees, watching his wife sleep. Layla's face was still swollen, but softer now under the pale sunlight, and the rhythmic beeping from the monitor beside her offered a strange kind of comfort. He hadn't moved from the chair all night. Every time a nurse came in, she glanced at him and said nothing. They all knew. There were no words for this. The baby's heartbeat had stabilized, and the doctor cautiously mentioned a good sign. But Jamal didn't hear optimism. He only heard a window of time, a space to act before it was too late. At 8:17 a.m., he took out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found one labeled Marcus P. He hadn't called that number in almost a year. They'd served together overseas, but Marcus had become a civil rights attorney in D.C., sharp as ever and twice as loud. Jamal hit the call button. When Marcus answered with, "You good, man?" Jamal exhaled like someone finally let him breathe. "No, but I'm focused." He kept the explanation short, just the facts. Layla, the officer, the kick, the hospital, the baby, the video, the silence from the precinct. Marcus didn't interrupt. When Jamal finished, there was a pause. Then Marcus said, "All right, I'm on my way. Don't talk to anyone. Don't post anything. We're going to do this smart." The call ended, and Jamal slipped the phone back into his jacket. He stood, stretched for the first time in hours, and walked to the window. Below, the street buzzed with early traffic, but something felt different in the air. Tighter. Charged. And it was because while Layla rested and Jamal prepared, the video of the assault had gone viral. A woman on the other side of the street had filmed the entire incident with clear audio and a steady hand. The caption she posted read, "He kicked a pregnant woman like she was trash. Say her name, Layla Bennett." By sunrise, the video had over 200,000 shares. By noon, it hit 3 million. The internet wasn't sleeping. Neither was Chicago. Hashtags flooded every platform. Comment sections exploded. Local news picked up the footage. Then national outlets. Within hours, it wasn't just a story. It was a movement. Protesters started gathering outside the hospital, holding signs that said, "Protect Black mothers and justice for Layla." Reporters arrived. Police cruisers circled, but didn't stop. And Jamal, standing next to the glass, felt the pressure build behind his ribs. Not fear, purpose. He turned back to Layla, who had stirred again, her hand resting on her belly, whispering something too soft to hear. He walked over, leaned in. Her voice was scratchy. "Don't do anything reckless." "I won't," he lied. A knock at the door interrupted them. A nurse peeked in. "There's a crowd gathering outside. They're asking for you." Jamal blinked. "For me?" "Yes, sir. A vigil. They're saying your name too." He looked at Layla, who managed a weak smile. "Go. Say something." He nodded once, kissed her forehead, and left the room. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors opened to the lobby, a security guard gave him a respectful nod. Outside, the crowd had doubled in size. Candles lined the steps. People of every background stood shoulder to shoulder. Some held signs. Others held each other. A local pastor passed him a megaphone. Jamal hesitated. Then he stepped forward, eyes scanning the crowd. "My name is Jamal Bennett," he began, voice low but firm. "And the woman you saw on that sidewalk, the one kicked for walking home with her unborn child, that's my wife. And that child, that's my son. We had plans. We had baby names. We had joy. And someone tried to take that away. Not just with a kick, with silence, with indifference, with power unchecked. But we are still here. She is still here. And now I'm here. And I will not let this go." A murmur of agreement rose around him, building into applause. Someone in the back shouted, "We got you, Jamal." He looked up, nodded once. The crowd quieted. "The fight's not just about us," he continued. "It's about every woman who's been ignored, every child who's been endangered, every officer who hides behind a badge while others pay the price. That ends today." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The clarity of his words carried farther than any scream. Cameras flashed. Reporters surged forward. Questions flew, but Jamal raised his hand. "No press. Not yet. We're not doing this the old way. We're doing it the right way." He turned and walked back inside. Upstairs, Layla waited with her hand pressed gently over her stomach. When Jamal stepped through the door again, she smiled softly. "You did good." He sat beside her, reached for her hand. "It's just the beginning. We have to build something now. Not just for us. For everyone." She nodded. "Then let's build." That night, as the city buzzed with protests and news coverage, Jamal and Marcus worked late into the evening in the hospital family room. Laptop open. Case files stacked. Marcus pulled up every complaint ever filed against Officer Madsen. There were more than a few. Some buried. Some mysteriously closed. All ignored. Marcus turned the screen. "Look at this. These are from 5 years ago. Same pattern. Aggressive use of force. Disproportionate response. No disciplinary action." Jamal stared at the names on the screen. People no one listened to. "Until now. We bring this forward. We don't just go after Madsen. We expose everyone who let him keep that badge." Marcus leaned back. "You ready for that?" Jamal didn't hesitate. "I was born ready." And just like that, the war began. Quiet first, but powerful. And they weren't fighting alone anymore. That'd be why the time the sun rose on the third day. The crowd outside the hospital had spilled into the street, blocking traffic with signs, chants, and a quiet determination that couldn't be ignored. Layla remained in stable condition, her bruises beginning to fade, her eyes more alert, though the soreness in her belly remained a constant reminder. Jamal stayed by her side each night and worked with Marcus each day, piecing together not just a case, but a movement. Inside a borrowed meeting room down the hall from Layla's room, Marcus had converted a rolling cart into a mobile legal ward desk, filled with documents, flash drives, and hand-scribbled notes. Jamal stood behind him, arms crossed, reading through a list of civilian complaints that had never reached disciplinary review. "These aren't just names," Jamal said quietly. "These are people, stories, warnings." Marcus nodded, and every one of them was ignored by someone higher up. "We have a paper trail, Manitoba, and it's ugly." The video of Layla's assault had now surpassed 10 million views across platforms. Celebrities tweeted. Elected officials made vague statements. But more importantly, survivors began to come forward. Women, veterans, students, people who had encountered Officer Madsen or others like him. Each had a story. Each had been dismissed. And now, each of them wanted to be heard. Jamal began meeting them one by one in the hospital cafeteria, sitting across from them as they told him what happened. Some came with police reports, others with only memory and pain. A young woman named Adriana broke down as she described being shoved to the ground by Madsen during a traffic stop when she was 16. "He made it sound like I was the problem," she said. "My mom told me to forget it. So I tried, but I never really did." Jamal listened to every word, took notes, and then told her, "You matter. And your story matters. We're not burying it." That night, Rosa Moreno, an investigative journalist with the Wilmington Times, flew in from D.C. She had worked with Marcus years ago on a case involving police corruption in Baltimore, and she came armed with a reputation for exposing what others wanted to hide. She met Jamal in the hospital hallway, shook his hand firmly, and said, "I'm here for the truth, wherever it leads." They set up a makeshift media briefing room just outside the ER, and Rosa began interviewing witnesses, survivors, and members of the community. Her questions were pointed, her tone sharp, and her pen moved quickly. While Jamal handled interviews and strategy, Marcus worked behind the scenes building a formal legal case. He compiled every complaint, traced the chain of command that ignored them, and began preparing to file suit not only against Madsen, but the city, the precinct, and its leadership. "This isn't just excessive force," Marcus said. "This is institutional negligence." They had every reason to know he was a danger, and they did nothing. On the fourth day, Jamal returned to Layla's room with a folder in his hands. Her face lit up when she saw him. "You look tired," she said softly. He smiled and sat beside her. "You always say that when I'm about to do something." She reached for his hand. "What is it?" He opened the folder and showed her copies of the formal complaints, photos, the emails they had retrieved through legal contacts, even a memo from a precinct supervisor expressing concern over Madsen's escalating aggression. "This is real, Layla. We have what we need to blow it open." She stared at the papers, then looked at him. "Are you ready for that kind of storm?" He didn't blink. "I'm not looking for a storm. I'm looking for daylight." The next morning, Jamal held a press conference outside City Hall. No podium, no grand entrance. Just him, Rosa, Marcus, and several survivors standing behind him. The crowd was bigger now, rows deep, with cameras flashing from every angle. "Good morning," Jamal began. "I didn't come here to ask for anything. I came here to show you what your city has been hiding." He held up a copy of the internal memo. This document proves that Officer Madsen was flagged repeatedly for aggressive behavior. It was ignored, buried, and because of that silence, my wife was nearly killed. The crowd stirred. Jamal continued, voice steady. "We are demanding not just his removal, but full criminal charges. We are calling for an independent review of every case he touched, and we're not stopping until every officer who looked the other way is held accountable." Rosa stepped forward next, reading excerpts from survivor interviews. Her voice cracked once as she spoke of an elderly man whose report had been erased. Marcus followed with the legal strategy, laying out the plan for civil and criminal litigation. The energy shifted. What had started as a tragedy was becoming a reckoning. The police department released a second statement that afternoon, announcing that Officer Madsen was now on unpaid administrative leave. The mayor's office agreed to meet behind closed doors. Jamal refused. "No more secrets," he said. "We talk in the open." That night, Layla sat upright in bed for the first time since the incident. Her voice was stronger. The bruises on her face, now shades of yellow and green. When Jamal returned from the press event, she took his hand. "You made them listen." He sat beside her, exhausted. "We're not done yet." She smiled, eyes shining with tired pride. "No, but we've started, and that's everything." Outside, the city buzzed with tension and hope. Inside, Jamal and Layla held onto each other like anchors, knowing the fight ahead would be fierce. But they had something the system didn't: the truth. And this time, it wasn't staying silent. The morning of the fifth day broke colder than usual, the kind of cold that snuck under doorways and into bones. Jamal stood alone outside the hospital, eyes fixed on the gray sky as his breath curled in the air. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Marcus had sent a single message. Got it. It was time. He headed back inside, stopped briefly at Layla's room. She was awake, sipping water, her belly rising and falling beneath the thin blanket. Her eyes met his. "You're going," she said gently. He nodded. "You sure?" She reached out, laced her fingers with his. "Just come back safe." He held her hand for a moment longer, then let go, picked up the manila folder sitting by the door, and walked out. No security escort, no press, just Jamal and evidence. He made his way to City Hall with his hood up and head down. When he arrived, the receptionist tried to wave him off, told him the mayor was in meetings. He said, "I'm not here for the mayor. Take me to Chief Moreland." 5 minutes later, he was standing across from the police chief in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. Moreland was flanked by two advisors, his face taut, his tie too tight. "I understand emotions are running high," Moreland began, trying to soften his tone. "But we are conducting a thorough internal review. Officer Madsen has been placed on unpaid administrative leave." Jamal didn't sit. He laid the folder on the table and opened it slowly. "What you call an internal review is actually a cover-up. These are the documents your department tried to bury. Complaint forms, supervisor warnings, field notes, training evals marked unfit for active duty. You knew who he was. You let him keep working. You let him kick my wife in the stomach. And then you let him go home like nothing happened." Moreland stiffened. "That's not fair. We followed protocol. Protocol doesn't leave a woman in a hospital bed begging her baby to stay alive." Jamal's voice rose. "You want fair. I want accountability." Moreland glanced at his aides. "What are you demanding?" Jamal leaned forward. "Full termination. Criminal charges for assault and endangerment. An internal investigation into everyone who signed off on Madsen's continued duty. Immediate suspension of immunity protections for repeat offenders. Transparency in use of force cases. And body cam footage released within 48 hours of any violent civilian interaction." Moreland blinked. "That's a lot. It's what's necessary." Jamal said it without blinking. "Do your job." There was silence, the kind that comes right before something breaks. Then Moreland cleared his throat and said, "You make it sound so simple." "It is. You just don't want to do it." Jamal didn't stay for the response. He left the folder on the table and walked out. On the steps outside City Hall, Rosa and Marcus were waiting. He gave them a nod, and they fell in a step beside him. "You think he heard you?" Rosa asked. Jamal exhaled slowly. "Not yet, but he will." That evening, Rosa ran the story. Front page. The headline read, "Buried warnings, broken bodies." Under it were quotes from former officers who tried to report Madsen. Whistleblowers. Some retired, some forced out. Their statements were raw, damning. By the next morning, public pressure had doubled. The mayor called for a formal inquiry. The governor issued a statement of support for independent oversight. And the police union began scrambling. Layla's name became a rallying cry. Schools organized teach-ins. Churches held prayers. Barbershops, community centers, subway cars. Everywhere people gathered, they talked about the video. They talked about her. Jamal kept his head down and worked. He met with lawyers. He reviewed policy. He spoke at events where people cried when they told their own stories. But the most important moments still happened quietly. In the hospital, at Layla's bedside, one night, as he returned late, she was awake, watching the news. "You started something," she said softly. "I didn't mean to. Maybe not. But you did. And you can't stop now." Jamal sat down, reached for her hand. "I'm not stopping. Not until they change the way this system works. And even then, I'll keep going." She smiled faintly, the lines of pain still near her eyes. "Then don't forget why you started. It was never just about punishment. It was about protection." He nodded. The next morning, a protest formed outside the police precinct. It wasn't angry. It was massive, peaceful. Teachers, nurses, mothers with strollers, elders in folding chairs. They held signs. They sang. They read poetry. Rosa stood near the front with her camera crew. Jamal arrived later, standing off to the side. He didn't need to be in front. The message was moving without him. But as the chants echoed through the air, he stepped forward and spoke once more. Not from stage, just from the ground. "We're not here today just because of one man. We are here because of every silent room, every buried complaint, every time someone said, 'It's not that bad. It was that bad. It is that bad.' And now we're watching." The crowd didn't cheer loudly. They didn't need to. They nodded, listened, understood. Later that night, as Jamal sat by Layla's bedside again, a nurse entered quietly and handed him a sealed envelope. It had no return address. Inside was a single note. "Back down, or we'll bury you in something deeper than paper." He folded it once, tucked it into his coat, and didn't say a word. Because he already knew. They were scared. And scared people make threats. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom felt colder than any Chicago winter Jamal had ever known. It wasn't the temperature, but the tension. The walls were lined with polished wood, and the air buzzed with a kind of silence that made people sit straighter and breathe shallower. The gallery was full. Reporters, community leaders, students, off-duty officers, survivors. Layla sat in the front row, a scarf wrapped gently around her neck, her stomach now visibly heavier as her due date neared. She was surrounded by support, but she held her own strength. The bailiff called for silence, and the jury filed in. Judge Evelyn Carr entered without ceremony, her presence quiet but commanding. This was the day everything would be said aloud. The prosecution played the video first. No commentary, no music, just a raw clip on a giant screen for everyone to witness again. Layla walking down the sidewalk. Madsen stopping her. The shove, the pause, the kick, the scream, the silence. Even those who had seen it 100 times gasped again. In that room, under court lighting and the weight of accountability, it struck deeper. The jury leaned forward. Some covered their mouths. One woman looked away. Jamal didn't watch the screen. He watched them, their eyes, their reactions, their humanity. When the clip ended, the prosecutor stood up and said, "You don't need a law degree to understand what you just saw. You just need a heart." Then it was Layla's turn. She stood slowly, walked to the witness stand with care, and took her oath. Her voice was soft but steady. He said, "I look suspicious. I told him I was going home. I said I was pregnant. I never raised my voice. I didn't argue, but he didn't care. He kicked me." Her lip trembled once. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly. The room held its breath. Then she added, "I begged him not to hurt me, and he did anyway." The defense tried to pivot, claimed Officer Madsen feared for his safety, suggested Layla's posture was aggressive. They leaned on the same tired script, turned the victim into the threat, turned fear into justification. But it didn't work. The jury had seen too much, heard too much. The prosecutor returned for closing arguments. She pointed to Layla, then to the screen. "We are not here because of a misunderstanding. We are here because of misconduct, because power, unchecked, becomes violence, because silence allowed it. And that silence ends today." Jamal was next. He didn't need to speak, but he asked to. He stood before the court and looked at every face. "I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to become a symbol. I wanted to be a husband, a father, a man who could trust the people sworn to protect us. But that trust was broken. And so now I fight, not with fists, not with hate, but with truth. And I won't stop until this system sees the people it's ignored." The verdict came late in the afternoon. Guilty, on all counts. The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no cheers, just tears, quiet ones. Layla's hand reached for Jamal's. He took it and held on. Outside, reporters swarmed. But Jamal didn't speak. Not yet. He walked Layla to the car, helped her in, and they drove away in silence. At home, they sat on the couch. No words, just stillness. Then she whispered, "We did it." He shook his head. "No, we started it." Days passed. The city shifted. People wrote letters. They sent flowers. They sent stories. Hundreds of them. Some said thank you. Some said finally. Some just said I see you. Layla read them aloud while rubbing her belly. They listened. And now, it's our turn to keep going. Weeks later, in the middle of the night, Layla woke up gripping the sheets. "It's time." Jamal scrambled, gathered the bag, rushed her to the hospital. Hours passed. The pain was sharp, but she was stronger. He held her hand, whispered through every contraction, "You got this. I'm here. You're safe." When her son was born, he cried so loud it echoed down the hall. Jamal held him close, tears slipping down his face. "He's here," he whispered. "We made it." They named him Justice, not for what they won, but for what they refused to stop fighting for. Justice Bennett, a name born from pain, carried in love. In the days that followed, Jamal returned to the hospital's family center. He started posting photos on the wall. Names, faces, stories. Some resolved, some still waiting. But all of them now had a place, a voice. One afternoon, a young man walked in with trembling hands, unsure if his story mattered. Jamal sat with him, listened, nodded, then said, "I'm here, so you don't give up." Outside, Chicago kept moving. The headlines faded, but something had changed. Because now, when someone said Layla Bennett, people remembered. Not just the video, but the victory. The proof that one voice, spoken with love and conviction, could move a mountain. And it did. Months passed, and spring unfolded across the city like a long exhale after holding breath through a storm. The sidewalks that once echoed with protest chants now welcomed baby strollers and laughter again. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Jamal felt it every time someone stopped him at the grocery store, every time someone placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you, not just for your wife, but for all of us." The community center he once managed part-time had now transformed into a full-time justice hub. It wasn't just for veterans anymore. It was for families, survivors, anyone who needed to be heard. People came with papers, with old grievances, with hope, and he sat with each of them, listening as if every word had weight. Justice, now nearly 6 months old, had become the quiet heartbeat of the space. People came intense, holding on to pain, but their faces softened when they saw him cooing in Layla's arms or taking bold, wobbly steps across the room. He had Layla's warmth and Jamal's steadiness. There was something in him that felt ancient and new at the same time, like he already understood why people were hurting and why they were still standing. One rainy Tuesday, Jamal returned from a city meeting and found Layla standing at the board in the front hall of the center, pinning a new letter on the wall. "More stories," she said without looking back. He kissed her temple and read the latest one. A woman who had been pushed face first into the pavement during a routine stop 5 years ago. No charges. No cameras. Just scars. "I never told anyone," she wrote, "until now." That wall had grown from a simple idea into something sacred. People traveled from across the state just to touch it. Some left pictures. Some left court documents. Some just wrote their names. It was no longer about just Layla or just Jamal. It was about everyone who had been told to stay quiet. One night, after locking up, Jamal stood in front of the wall alone. He stared at the names and photos and thought about how they got here. The trial, the verdict, the protests, the death threats, the moments where he almost broke. And then he thought of Justice's first laugh, of Layla's breath steady in sleep, of the ripple effect they had started. And he knew it wasn't about how loud they had shouted. It was about how deeply they had listened. Mayor Harper had since changed his stance. He publicly backed new legislation, one Jamal and Marcus had co-authored with the city's Civil Rights Board. It required all police officers to undergo recurring bias training, mandated third-party reviews of excessive force cases, and guaranteed the release of body camera footage within 2 days of any violent civilian encounter. But Jamal wasn't chasing politics. He showed up at schools, sat in on panels, visited churches and mosques and barbershops. He looked people in the eye and reminded them, this isn't over. Change doesn't just live in courtrooms. It lives in us. One Friday afternoon, Rosa called. She'd been nominated for a national award for her reporting on Layla's case, but she didn't want to talk about herself. She wanted to tell Jamal that something bigger was coming. National networks had begun reaching out. People were asking to replicate the Justice Hub model in other cities. "You started a blueprint," she said. "This isn't just Chicago anymore." He didn't know what to say, so he just whispered, "Thank you." That weekend, they held a community cookout in the park down the block. Nothing fancy, just music, food, folding chairs, and laughter. Layla sat under a tree, shaded and radiant, while Justice napped against her chest. Jamal stood off to the side, arms crossed, scanning the faces. People who had once been afraid were now laughing together. People who never spoke to each other were breaking bread. A boy with a missing tooth asked Jamal if Justice was going to be a superhero when he grew up. Jamal chuckled and knelt down. He already is. As the sun dipped below the skyline and the sky turned gold and purple, Jamal felt a quiet settle inside him. Not the end of the story, just a chapter closing. He turned to Layla. "You okay?" he asked. She looked at him, eyes full of light. "I think we all are." The moment held, steady and clean. They didn't need applause or headlines anymore. They had built something that breathed on its own. A space where truth was safe and voices were loud, and children could grow up knowing that justice wasn't an abstract idea, but something real, something earned, something passed on. And as the last light faded from the sky, Jamal lifted his son onto his shoulders, feeling the small hands grip his forehead, feeling the weight and the promise. Ahead of them, people danced. Behind them, the pain still lingered. But right here, in this moment, there was peace. And that was enough to keep walking. If this story moved you even a little, don't just scroll away. Leave a comment below and let us know how it made you feel. Share this video with someone who still believes change is possible. And if you want to see more powerful stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Your voice matters. Your presence matters. Together, we're not just telling stories, we're rebuilding something that lasts. Thank you for watching.